Conscientiousness is one of the 5 personality traits of the 5-factor model. What is conscientiousness? What does it look like? Well, we're going to be talking all about that today on Real Talk. Let's go. Welcome back to another episode of Real Talk with Kane Adams. We are currently going through our series all about personalities, and we're looking particularly at the big 5-factor model, which is a personality psychometric test, which you can take at understandmyself.com. And last week we talked about agreeableness. Agreeableness can be measured in regards to negotiation. So if you're high in agreeableness, it means that you're more likely to put other people's interests before your own. And if you are low in agreeableness, you're more likely to put your own interests before the interests of other people. And particularly, I think in regards to negotiation, it's more so that if you are high in agreeableness, you're more likely to negotiate on somebody else's behalf against your own desires. And so we talked about that all last week. So if you missed it, you can check it out. And today we're going to be talking about conscientiousness. And so we're going to answer 3 questions, just like we did last week. What is conscientiousness? What are the advantages and disadvantages of being high in conscientiousness? And then what are the advantages and disadvantages of being low in conscientiousness? So a lot of this material has been collated together from the teachings of Dr. Jordan Peterson, who I'm sure you're familiar with. And so I've put a link in the description that you can look at of some of his teachings, that if you want to go into conscientiousness in a bit more detail, you can click on that link and watch that. And if you haven't done the test, once again, you can take the test at understandmyself.com. It's a fantastic test, lots of questions that you'll answer. So it only takes about 10-15 minutes, and then it'll give you a really detailed report. And if you haven't taken the test, I highly recommend that you do that before you watch this episode. Okay, well, let's get into it then. Conscientiousness. What is conscientiousness? Conscientiousness is a personality trait that's associated with work ethic and with order. So if you're a conscientious person, you're going to be a hard worker and you're going to thrive on order. You're going to have a natural tendency to want to bear responsibility, a natural tendency to be industrious, to be dutiful, to work hard, but also to do things in an orderly fashion. You're more likely to be a perfectionist. You want things done right. So you get things done and you get things done right would be an example of someone who is high in conscientiousness. If you're high in conscientiousness, you can't stand sitting around doing nothing. And I think a reason for this is because there's a collective idea that as human beings, that we have the responsibility or the obligation to contribute what we need to in order to make society a better place or a more productive place. We need to share the labor amongst ourselves. And people who are high in conscientiousness really feel and really value that. And so that's where you can have a lot of tension or conflict between people who are high in conscientiousness and low in conscientiousness because they don't share that same value. And so that would be typical of someone who's high in conscientiousness. They feel guilty if they're not doing something productive, and I'm sure that we know people who are like that. So conscientiousness is broken down into 2 subtraits, which are industriousness and orderliness. What's the difference between those 2? So industriousness is associated with work ethic. It's the getting stuck in motive. It's the ability to be able to focus, to produce, to work hard, to just to muck in and get the job done. Whereas orderliness tends to be associated with order, with order. So like someone who is orderly likes things in particular boxes. They tend to be a black and white thinker. And we'll go into all of that anyway. It is possible, yes, that you could be high in industriousness and also low in orderliness. And likewise the opposite, you could be high in orderliness and low in industriousness. But typically, if you are high in one, you tend to be high in the other as well. Okay, these are some common behaviors of people who are high in industriousness. They tend to carry out plans. They finish what they start. They don't waste time. They are do-it-now people. They get things done quickly and right. They are highly focused. They're not easily distracted. They are hard workers. They are intentional. They always know what they're doing. And then some behaviors among people who are high in orderliness. They are tidy people. They thrive on routine. They are detailed-oriented. They see that the rules are observed. They are perfectionists. They want everything to be perfect. They are bothered by disorder and chaos, and they compartmentalize their lives. So they take their lives and they put it into specific boxes in their mind in order to make sense of it. Okay, so what are some advantages and disadvantages of being high in conscientiousness? So conscientiousness is one of those personality traits that's a bit of a catch-22. So if you are high in conscientiousness, there could be some big rewards and big payoffs that come with it. For example, they say that conscientiousness is the biggest predictor for financial success. And so if you're high in conscientiousness, you get things done, you work hard, and you reap the benefits from that. But at the same time, extreme conscientiousness can be unbelievably detrimental to your life if you don't know how to manage it. And so we're going to talk about all that. Okay, advantages. So, well, it could be said that a huge advantage of being conscientious is that you work all the time. And then a huge disadvantage of being conscientious is that you work all the time. So it goes, I suppose, without saying that the higher you are in conscientiousness, the harder worker you're going to be. You're going to be that's not necessarily true. I'll take that back. The higher in conscientiousness you are, the proclivity you have to be a harder worker. The more tendency you would have, because it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be a harder worker, because that's probably a choice that you make. A conscientious person is a reliable person. They thrive on responsibility, which is very favorable in the workplace. And we mentioned this last time talking about agreeableness. So if you are high in agreeableness and high in conscientiousness, it means that you are more likely to do over and above what you're asked to do, and you are not going to complain about it. And that's just the perfect employee. And companies are going to be looking for these kind of people. People who are willing to work hard and are not willing to complain about it as well. And so obviously, and we talked about this last time too, is that the biggest disadvantage of that is that you become a prime target of being taken advantage of. Because big companies, they're not going to place boundaries for you. You know, if they are receiving an abundance of non-complaining, compliant productivity, then they're not going to throw that in the bin. They're going to let that be. They're going to take as much of that and of you as they possibly can. So it's your responsibility to be able to put those boundaries in place and to learn to say no. And people who are conscientious, may not have problems with saying no, but if you combine conscientiousness with agreeableness, you're going to have a very hard worker who is not going to be able to say no. And again, we said this last episode as well. If you work really hard and go beyond your means and beyond what you are willing to do, but you don't say anything about it, or you don't stand up for yourself, then you start to grow resentful, which can lead you into a very nasty place, and you don't want to do that. So if you're high in conscientiousness and high in agreeableness, it's important that you learn to place the boundaries that you need to place and learn to say no. Okay, so before I go into the disadvantages of high conscientiousness, and I know that there are probably a lot more advantages to conscientiousness, but for the sake of time, we're kind of just flying through it. I want to highlight a really important aspect about high conscientiousness, and that is this, is that high conscientiousness is associated with judgment and with disgust response or disgust sensitivity. So what I mean by that is that people who are high in conscientiousness are more likely to project judgmental thoughts or judgment upon people who don't share the same value as them. And they're also likely to be higher in disgust response sensitivity. So what do we mean by that? What is disgust? Okay, let's start there. What is disgust? I've got this great quote that Dr. Jordan Peterson talked about in one of his lectures, and it explains disgust as this. Disgust is considered to be one of the basic human emotions defined by a strong revulsion and desire to withdraw from an eliciting stimulus or event. So what disgust is an automatic physical response, right? We want to withdraw from that we find disgusting. And I suppose the roots of disgust can be found in the biological sense, that in the form of physical contamination. So let's say you have a harmful pathogen that enters your body and either contaminates your body or has the potential to contaminate your body. What your brain is going to do is it's going to employ the systems necessary to extract or expel those harmful pathogens outside of your body, and it will do whatever it needs to do to separate that. For example, whether that's through vomiting or through sweating or through excretion or whatever necessary to get those harmful pathogens out and to disassociate your body and protect your body from being contaminated. And so that's kind of where disgust is kind of rooted from, right? But there's another interesting quote here, and Jordan Peterson talks about this in his lecture as well, from Mark Scholler and Leslie Duncan. And I find this really insightful, and it says this: in addition to its role in directly helping to expel harmful foods from the body, disgust also forms an important component of the behavioral immune system, the suite of psychological mechanisms that aid in the detection and avoidance of potential contamination before they can make contact with the body. Although disgust may have its origins in the protection against the physical contamination, a number of studies have implicated disgust responses in moral decision-making as well. So what's interesting is that the disgust response not only is associated with physical bodily contamination, but it can be associated with moral behavior as well as social behavior as well. So people can be disgusted by behaviors. They can be disgusted by chaos, by mess, by disorder. And people who are high in orderliness will often find themselves disgusted by chaos and by disorder more so than their counterparts. So what happens is that when our disgust response is triggered from a moral behavior or from a social behavior, what our brain does is that it tells our body to act in the same way or to respond with the same urgency as if we ought to expel a harmful pathogen that's physically in our body and causing physical contamination. It responds in the same way. And we can see this quite clearly in a few examples. For example, you might be reading about, say, a murder that has happened in the newspaper, and the perpetrator killed the victim in a sadistic and a sexual manner. And when we read through the details of it, we feel disgusted, we feel like we want to throw up, or we feel sick to our stomach about it. Now, there's no harmful pathogens in our body that's contaminating us physically. There's nothing there. But our body is responding in the same way because what we're reading about is morally reprehensible. And so we want to have that same disassociation, and our body has that same response to separate ourselves from that behavior. Even just reading about it causes us to want to separate. It causes us to want to separate it, for example. And that's from the moral front. And then from the social front, a good example would be a phenomenon known as the ick, which I'm sure people have been familiar with in the dating world. It's something that happens in the dating world, and I've always found it quite interesting. And so what happens is that, let's say that you're on a date with someone. Things are going swimmingly well. You're passionate about this person. You want to get to know them more. You want to spend every aching moment with them. You love spending time with them. You love messaging them and doing all these things, and you're infatuated with them. And then all of a sudden, they do some sort of behavior or something happens that causes you to suddenly want nothing to do with them. You want to disassociate yourself and you want to separate with them. This is known as the ick. So an example of this would be, and it could be small things that are not morally wrong, but could be socially deemed as awkward or socially unacceptable in your sight, even though they're not morally wrong. For example, someone might, I don't know, arrive on the date wearing a Hawaiian shirt, or they might have a silly inflection in their laugh that, or something, or they might clap when the plane lands. All of these kind of social behaviors, which they're not wrong in themselves, but causes you to feel, it triggers your disgust response. And that's what the ick is. The ick is a disgust response. And what's happening is that your body is wanting to disassociate from that kind of behavior and it's not that you don't agree with it, it's because it's not a reflection of who you are, and there's something about it that you find reprehensible and you want nothing to do with. And it's unfortunate because, I often say people who experience the ick, if it's really bad, there's no going back from it, and there's a difference between something annoying you. And something can annoy you, like someone's always late or something like that. But there's a difference between something annoying you and then something disgusting you. And if something disgusts you, you look at it with a with what's the word? With contempt. You look at it with contempt, and you want nothing to do with it. A reason also for that, I think, is because, say, let's take the example of someone who claps when the plane lands. If it's a random stranger, you might look at them and think, oh, yeah, that's kind of gross, but whatever. You don't think much of it. But if it's someone that you're dating, it means that it's someone that you're connected to. And you're in a position or in an environment where people around you are looking at you as an item, as one unit, as one unit together, right? And so if he claps when the plane lands, then you're going to think in the back of your mind that people are going to think, because you're together and you're one item, that you're going to agree and value such behavior, which of course you don't if that's the case. And there's nothing wrong with clapping when the plane lands, but or maybe there is. But anyway, and so you will see that as a reflection of your identity, of who you are, which is going to trigger the disgust response, because you don't want anything to do with that behavior, and you don't want people thinking that you would agree with that behavior, which is why it tends to be stronger with when it's someone that you are connected with, particularly in a romantic relationship, that disgust response is going to be triggered. Anyway, so those are just two examples of disgust response. From a moral, what that highlights is that it's interesting how disgust is not just from a physical contamination perspective, but it can be triggered through moral behavior or through social behavior as well. And people, I guess the whole point of that is that people who are high in conscientiousness, particularly orderliness from a personality perspective, are going to be more likely to experience the ick, for example, or they're going to be more likely to have a sensitive disgust response. And that is something to take note of. That's something to be, it's quite an interesting point. Anyway. Okay, so why am I talking about disgust? What has disgust got to do with all this? Well, disgust, it's important because it leans in to some really serious disadvantages of being high in conscientiousness, particularly orderliness. And if you find yourself high in orderliness, as well as high neuroticism, which we'll talk about later, which is a sensitivity to negative emotion. So you're sensitive to negative emotion if you're high in neuroticism. Those two together, if not managed well, can bring great detriment to your life. And I'll give you two examples of this. The first one being obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. So people who are high in orderliness tend to, they have a potential to become obsessively compulsive, right? And so what is OCD? OCD, just in a nutshell, would be the strong desire to place everything they can in boxes and to have everything perfect. You hear about people who, like when they're brushing. I remember I went to school with this guy, and he was telling me about how he used to brush his teeth 7 times with each place in his mouth. So he would brush 7 times on his left side, 7 times on his right side, 7 times on the front, 7 times on the back. And that's obsessive compulsive disorder. And if you don't do 7 times, if you did 8 times or 6 times or 10 times, then you can't deal with it. You struggle with it, right? And you can see it in kind of, little micro examples as well of people who have to check that the door is locked. They lock the door, they start walking to the car, and they think, have I locked the door? And they go back and they check again, and they go to the car, and they get to the point where you're putting your key in the door and you're saying to yourself, I am locking the door, and that can be kind of a very minimal sense of OCD, an example of OCD, but you can see how it can go into extreme lengths, right? Where people become so obsessive compulsive that it affects their daily life. And what it is really, it's a fear of chaos. OCD is a fear of chaos. So you've got the world that is divided basically into order and chaos. And kind of the sweet spot would be somewhere in the middle, right? Because if you have a world that is nothing but chaos, then everything's going to be anarchical. It'll be anarchy, right? Everyone will be doing whatever the hell they want to do, and no one will be following any orders whatsoever. It'll be total anarchy. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, you've got order. Extreme order will be nothing but tyranny. So authoritarianism. It'll be a slave and tyrant situation. People will be slaves, and people who suffer from OCD are on that extreme order side of the spectrum. Basically, they become slaves to their own tyrannical structure, and that's what OCD is. And so that's one example. Another example of high orderliness and high neuroticism gone extreme would be eating disorders. And obviously, I want to be careful and tread lightly on this one, but disgust response plays a huge role when it comes to eating disorders. And obviously a lot of it would be negative emotion. So people who are experiencing anxiety, experiencing depression, and high levels of neuroticism from a personality perspective would play a big factor in it. But really, disgust is the driving force behind eating disorders. And it's interesting because they say that that eating disorders tends to affect mostly women who are of the middle and upper class. And you wonder why that would be. And I think a reason why that is because women who are of the middle and upper class are high achievers. And people who are high achievers tend to be in high conscientiousness. So if you're high in conscientiousness, it means you're going to be more sensitive to disgust and more sensitive to judgment. And the problem is that when, and I say women, I suppose men could fall into this as well, but the vast majority of people who suffer from eating disorders are women, is that the problem is that if you project that disgust, that sense of disgust and that sense of judgment upon yourself as a woman to an extreme length, then that can turn it into wanting to perfect the body and wanting to bring order out of the chaos. Remember, it's a fear of chaos. So you bring extreme order, and that can look like bringing order to your own body. And what happens is a woman can become so disgusted with her own body that she begins to lose perception of what a healthy body should look like, and she loses the perception of what of her body as a whole. And so she sees her body as little bits of fat, I guess you could say, here and there, trim this part, trim that part, to the point where it just goes into this never-ending cycle, and they can't even see what their body looks like as a whole, and they're only able to see specific parts of her body, and unable to determine which parts are healthy and which parts are unhealthy. And it's not a good place, obviously, to be in. Now, obviously, disgust response is not an only factor when it comes to eating disorders. There are a lot of factors that can play into that. For example, perhaps a lack of connection or a strong desire for connection, or parental attachment can definitely play a role. But we're just talking, because this is a series about personality, we're just talking about it from a personality perspective. And so, yeah, so that would be something, I suppose, if you're a woman and you are high in orderliness, you've taken the test and you find yourself to be very high in orderliness and high in neuroticism, then those are the kind of things that you need to watch out for as well. Now, if you take orderliness to an absolute extreme example, then you'll have Adolf Hitler. And think about it, because, after the First World War, a little history lesson here, after the First World War, Germany found themselves in absolute utter chaos, especially with the Great Depression as well, and the stock market crash in 1929. Germany was in absolute utter chaos. It was suffering from hyperinflation, extreme hyperinflation. You hear stories about how it got to a point where people, instead of buying firewood to warm themselves, they would actually just light their money on fire. They'd light the German mark on fire, because it was cheaper to light bundles of money on fire than it was to buy actual firewood. It got that bad. And so Germany were in absolute utter chaos. And so, well, what's the antidote to chaos? Order. And order is exactly what Adolf Hitler brought. And that was what was so, I suppose, appealing about the Nazi Party in the 1930s, was that they promised complete order. And so Germany took to that like a duck takes to water, basically. And that's exactly what Hitler brought. You look at the Nuremberg rallies and videos of that, and you see every soldier who was completely in line, not a single soldier out of line. And he brought absolute order. And you know what? That order came from his own personality. Something to note about Hitler was that he was a massive germaphobe. So he used to have 4 baths a day. He was obsessed, absolutely obsessed with cleanliness. And that's OCD, it's orderliness, and it's a high disgust response. And the problem with that was that, and I'm explaining this quite simply, it's more complex than this, is that disgust response started initially with germs, then went on to animals, and then eventually went on to human beings. And you see this because one of the first initiatives that the Nazi Party brought when they came into power was to rid all the factories of rodents and of mice and of any animals that would be contaminating the factories. And Ironically, they used Zyklon B was the gas that they used to get rid of these animals, which ironically was the same gas that they used in the chambers at Auschwitz and some of the concentration camps. But it started off with animals, right? Get rid of all the animals, see the animals as parasites. And then eventually it turned into getting rid of people who didn't contribute to society through euthanasia. So that whether that was old people, whether it was disabled people, and euthanasia crept into that as well. And then after euthanasia came eugenics, which was seeing entire races, like the Jewish people, as parasites and using propaganda to convince the country of that lie, which is scary, very scary stuff. But that's what I'm saying is that's orderliness on absolute steroids, where it's like you get to the point. I mean, I hate to think, if it's like if the concentration camps weren't found and weren't discovered, how far would Hitler have gone? Would he have begun to see other races? Would he have eliminated females? It's like, I don't know, but it's just disgust absolutely gone wrong. Disgust response and OCD. And so, but anyway, that's just an example of extremely, extremely high conscientiousness. The main disadvantages of, I suppose, of industriousness, because we haven't talked about that one too much. One of the main disadvantages of industriousness is that when people who are very high in industriousness are not doing anything, then they can feel like a failure. And people can take that very personally and can allow that to affect them in a way, particularly if they're high in neuroticism, where they can feel like a failure. And so it can lead into unhealthy feelings of guilt. That they're not bearing the responsibility that they ought to be bearing, and that they should take on responsibility more than they should. And this is what happens, like we said, people who... So then, I suppose you could say in turn, people who are high in industriousness will then go on to accept responsibility more so than they should, which can lead to burnout. And you see this in companies all the time. People, again, who are high in agreeableness and high in conscientiousness, taken advantage of, and they're burnt out. And so it's something to take very seriously. Boundaries would be your antidote to burnout, and we talked about that a little bit before. So, again, people who are high in industriousness just need to learn to place the boundaries in place and say no when they need to. Okay, so some advantages and disadvantages of low conscientiousness. So here are some common behaviors of people who are low in industriousness. They fail to finish what they start. They struggle to delay gratification. They put things off, take a long time to do tasks. They're easily distracted. They take the easiest path. They value leisure over work, which is not a bad thing, by the way. It's not a bad thing to value leisure over work. Some common behaviors among people who are low in orderliness. They are messy people. Tend to be messy people, I suppose you could say. They struggle to keep routine. They are big picture oriented instead of details, which is not a bad thing. And that can be related to openness to experience as well, which we'll go into. They are not perfectionists, which is also not a bad thing. They are not bothered by disorder and chaos. They view their life as a whole instead of separate entities. That's interesting as well. So that's kind of the opposite of OCD. Instead of putting everything into little boxes, they view their life and every aspect of it as a collective, as one thing, as a whole. Okay, disadvantages. Well, the disadvantages are probably pretty obvious. People who are low in conscientiousness struggle to finish tasks. And because of this, they're less likely perhaps to succeed from a financial perspective, and they're less likely to be hired by companies, because companies don't want people who are not conscientious. They don't want people who are not willing to work. Now, I wouldn't say that people who are not conscientious are lazy, because that's not the case. I believe laziness is a choice. You choose to be lazy. What it means is that people who are low in conscientiousness don't have the natural biological drive to work hard from a personality perspective. It doesn't mean that they can't choose to work hard. It just means that to be driven to take on responsibility that they ought not to take is not part of their personality temperament. People who are low in conscientiousness struggle to delay gratification, which can mean that they suffer for it in the future. These are disadvantages, by the way. Especially when coupled with high extroversion, because if you're high in extroversion, that's the impulse sensitivity. So you tend to be impulsive because you're sensitive to positive emotion. And if you're low in conscientiousness, it means that you're just going to be there's a potential of living your life to the whim of the moment, and doing whatever you feel like doing at the time, which can cost you in the future because it means you're really living for the present. Not necessarily a bad thing. Obviously, things have their extremes. If you live too much into the future, that can have detriment effects on you. But of course, if you live too much in the present, then that can have detriment effects on you as well. Okay, what about some advantages? Because yes, there are some advantages of people who are low on conscientiousness. One of the biggest ones really is that they value leisure. And that's an important thing to value. I remember not long ago reading an article about these nurses who were interviewing these people who are on their deathbeds, kind of dying by old age, and asked them, what was your biggest regret in life? And the second biggest regret in life, collectively, that people said was that I wish I didn't work so hard. And isn't that interesting, And that's something that's very telling, is that we live in a society where hard work can become the biggest value over even things like intimate relationships or family life or community life or church life or whatever it is, or faith or belief. And so people who, I suppose you could say, people who are low in conscientiousness would not be under the threat or the risk of having that regret later on in life, because they substitute hard work for things like spending time with family or spending times with loved ones or things like that. And so that's a really, really big advantage. Another advantage of being low in conscientiousness is that you tend not to be a perfectionist. So if you're high in conscientiousness, you're a perfectionist. You tend to be. But if you're low in conscientiousness, you tend to not be a perfectionist, which has its advantages, because sometimes you just need to get the job done. Sometimes you don't need to. The best thing to do is to not spend hours and hours and days getting something done perfectly, but you actually just need to get it done. And that's a massive advantage. I think of a historical example of this one would be going back to the Second World War, like we talked about before. During the Second World War, Germany were making these tanks called the Panther tanks and the Tiger tanks, and they were these just absolute beasts of a tank. They spent a long time perfecting these tanks and making them durable. So they were durable, they were strong, and they were able to last a long time, basically. Whereas the US, they made the Sherman tanks, which were almost like disposable tanks. They were roughly put together. The goal was just to make as many as you could, as many Sherman tanks as you could. And so that was kind of the US's goal. And you know what? That goal paid off, because I guess you could say for every one German tank, about 10 US tanks were made, and it absolutely helped them and aided them to victory at the end. And it was probably one of the few examples where quantity is actually better than quality. So while the Germans were spending all this time perfecting the tanks, the US just made as many as they could, and that helped them tremendously to win the World War. So sometimes that's the case. There's a saying which I often think about called GETMO, an acronym, GETMO, GETMO, which stands for good enough to move on. And sometimes you need to have that perspective in life, that there are some things you want to do perfectly, but at the end of the day, you're never going to get anything perfectly done. But sometimes you just have to GETMO, good enough to move on. Sometimes you just have to move on. So those are some advantages. Anyway, so we've run out of time, but that's conscientiousness. So a lot to pack in there, a lot to think about. Really interesting stuff, mainly about disgust response. But anyway, so that's conscientiousness in a nutshell. Hope you really enjoyed it. Next week, we're going to be talking about extroversion, which is a tendency, it's sensitivity to positive emotion. So anyway, we'll talk about that next week. Hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll see you then.